Well, it is with great deal of pleasure that I introduce our speaker, Chuck Colson. Chuck is chairman of the board of Prison Fellowship Ministries and outreach to prisoners, ex-prisoners, victims of crimes, and their families. Chuck served as special counsel to President Richard Nixon from 1969 to 1973. And in 1974, he pleaded guilty to charges related to Watergate and served 7 months in prison. God used that prison experience to lead Chuck to found Prison Fellowship in 1976. Today, more than 225 Prison Fellowship employees and 50,000 volunteers are used to transform lives across the country. Prison Fellowship International links prison ministries in 88 countries around the world. Many of you, like longtime supporter Martha Linder and her promoted husband Scott, have been strong supporters of this exceptional ministry. In 1993, Chuck was the recipient of the Templeton Prize for Progress in Religion. He is a respected author, speaker, columnist, and his daily radio commentary, Breakpoint, can be heard on 436 radio stations nationwide and over 1,000 other different outlets. Among his best-selling books are The Body, Loving God, Kingdoms in Conflict, and most recently released Being the Body, as well as Born Again, which details his experience as President Nixon's assistant, his conversion in the midst of Watergate, and his ordeal personally in prison. Chuck's legacy book, How Now Shall We Live, equips Christians to articulate the truth of the gospel, live it accordingly, and give a defense of that truth to other believers. The Templeton Prize and all speaking fees and book royalties are donated back to the ministry of Prison Fellowship. Now that's Chuck Colson as an incredibly accomplished individual, truly perhaps one of the most brilliant minds of our day. But I have the privilege of knowing Chuck through a different window. You see, for over the past 20 years, he's been my father's best friend, outside of the family, of course. And in that light, I have seen his many tiny kindnesses, his abiding friendship, and his incredible humbleness. I have even received a call from him once when I was at work, advising me that my dad had gone to the hospital and I needed to come be with him right away. And actually, it was more of an order than a suggestion. Chuck Colson has a heart of gold, dedicated to serving Jesus Christ, and that is what makes him such a powerful blessing to Prison Fellowship and so many others. Let's welcome Chuck.
Thank you very much, Bill. That was very kind, and thank you for that gracious welcome. It is indeed is true that I'm here tonight because my dear friend Oz and his wife Jean, also best friend, and his best friend and my best friend as well, when they left Naples, which was now 6 or 8 months ago, it was a real loss to us because they've been such close personal friends. I said, there's just one thing I want you to do. I want you to come and speak for the Lakeland Christian School. It's their 50th anniversary. And I said, of course I will do that. And I'm thrilled to be here tonight and to be part of this wonderful celebration. 50 years of raising up generations of kids who sing like that and who testify like that, as we saw in that film tonight. I think that's a great accomplishment, and I congratulate you for what you're doing and being so faithful doing it over the years. When I listen to those introductions, and the older you get, the longer the introduction gets, the more things people have to say about you, and you know, it could kind of puff you up. I mean, you could listen to all those things and get sort of impressed, except for the fact that God finds wonderful ways to keep me humble. Some months ago, I was on an airplane, and a woman came up to me and she said, Mr. Colson, would you sign this card so I can put it in my son's book? And I get asked that a lot because I've written a lot of books. And so I said, sure, I'll sign it. And I started to sign it. I said, which one of my books is he reading? And she said, oh, it's not one of your books. You're in his history book. That's a little tough. These are frightening times in which we live. It's hard to pick up the newspaper and read about Iraq and not realize, and the threat of terrorism constantly hanging over our head, what a precarious, dangerous time this is in the world. 2,000 al-Qaeda cells, we don't even know where half of them are. And a television show this week showing that there's continuing to train more terrorists out of the desert. This is something that we've never faced in this country before. I can remember when I was in the White House and we would have the briefings by the admirals and the generals about the nuclear deterrent versus the Soviet Union. And we'd get these briefings about how many missiles we had and throw weight and whether we had a first strike defense and all of this argument. And the Vietnam War was going on at the time, and I would go home many nights and I would be almost physically ill thinking of the responsibilities that the president whom I served had, and all of us had in the White House. And those were scary days, not anywhere near as scary as what we're facing today. The possibility anytime of someone getting a suitcase and bringing it in on an airplane and leaving it in the middle of a street with a dirty nuclear bomb, which one such effort was being made when Jose Padilla was arrested. What we're witnessing is something that is so critical for the church to understand, for Christian people to understand. This is a clash of civilizations. Samuel Huntington, the professor at Harvard, professor emeritus now, who wrote that extraordinary book by that same title, Clash of Civilizations, in the 90s, predicted, he said, the three great civilizations, Eastern religions on the one hand, and then Western Christian, Judeo-Christian democracies on the other, and then in the middle, 30-some nations of Islam spread around the girth of the world from Indonesia to Nigeria. And he said the great dynamic of the 21st century will be the clash between Islam and the West. He picked it exactly right. He saw the militants of the extreme radicals in the Islamic movement and saw exactly where it would lead. Well, these are frightening times, and whenever I talk about this, whenever I start talking about the church has to be the church and get out of our comfortable sanctuaries and go do the gospel, I'll always get a flood of emails from people when I talk about that over the radio, and they'll say to me, oh, but things are so tough in the world and it's so dangerous. We just have to build our church and we have to stay within. Why are you urging us to do these things? These are times when we can't change what's happening. Maybe this is the end times. I get all kinds of communications like that. That is dead wrong. People wanting to draw into their sanctuaries. You remember when Governor Ridge came out and announced that there might be a biochemical attack, and all the hardware stores in America were sold out of plastic sheeting and duct tape the next day? I mean, as if you can hermetically seal yourself off. Can't do that, nor should we do that. This is a time for Christians to be bold about what we do and what we're called to do. This is a time for Christians to be courageous and to do our duty. Despair is never an option for Christians because despair is a sin because it denies the sovereignty of God. And I had an occasion just recently to realize how important it is for us to remember this is the Lord's battle. And all he asks us to do is to persevere day after day, month after month, week after week, year after year, and do what is right in our communities and in our political system and do what is right in our society with all that we do. You remember the partial birth abortion ban when that was proposed some years ago. And the battle raged in the Congress, and it was enacted. And then, of course, President Clinton vetoed it. And many of us spent a lot of time up on Capitol Hill in which we were lobbying senators to override the president's veto. Never could do it. Defeat after defeat. Well, as you may have read, and as you know and probably saw on television, the partial birth abortion ban was passed, and just a few weeks ago, President Bush signed it into law. He was kind enough that day to invite a few of us in to meet with him before the signing. And we sat in the Oval Office, and it was, for me, a very, very poignant moment because not only was it a joy to be there when he was going to sign that bill, but as I was sitting there on the sofa in the Oval Office with the sun streaming in from the rose garden outside over my shoulder, all I could think back to was the time that Jim Dobson and I had traveled all over the Senate trying to win votes in 1998 to override the president's veto, and we were frustrated and frustrated and frustrated. People kept turning us down, and it was a really depressing day, and we sat in the gallery and watched that vote, and a child's voice cried out, no one knew from where, and all the senators were stunned. It was a very dramatic moment. And then they voted to sustain the veto, and we lost. And I went down that day, Jim Dobson and I went down to the marble room, just off the reception room, just off the Senate floor, and there was Kate Michelman and all of her bobbed haircuts and tweed-jacketed lieutenants bouncing up and down, joyous, celebrating, high-fiving. And I thought, I can't believe, this is the second time this had happened, I can't believe that people would be dancing. What has happened in this country when people are so overjoyed that babies can be killed inches from birth in the birth canal? Both Jim and I went off that night and we were in despair. We thought, how are we going to keep fighting this fight? Well, 5 years later, we're sitting in the Oval Office with the president about to sign it. Never give up. Two things went through my mind that day. I realized there's a lesson in this. Never quit when you're fighting. And the second thing I thought about was there was a man who should have been sitting in that office with me and couldn't be because he's now sitting on the bench here in Florida. That was the man who came up with the campaign for partial birth abortion and who filed the first bill and started the first crusade in the Congress and was successful year after year, but of course the president vetoed it. Well, now that bill has passed, and that's your former congressman who's here tonight, Charles Kennedy, for whom I have the utmost admiration. Charles and Jennifer, we appreciate that. But you know, even though these are tough times, often the worst of times can be the best of times. There's always another side to it. 9/11 did something to this country profound, not just the horror of those buildings collapsing and the Pentagon being attacked, not just the terrible shock that was to the nation's psyche, but it woke us up. As Samuel Johnson, the great British writer, the great English writer, once wrote about the hangman's noose, he said it marvelously concentrates the mind. Well, 9/11 has marvelously concentrated the mind. I don't think there's anybody in America today who listens to the postmodern psychobabble which says there is no such thing as good and evil. You can't look at those planes going into the World Trade Center towers and not say there is something that's evil and wrong. And people are sobering up. You see it in all the polls. The soccer moms who were so decisive in the election in 2000. Poll was done of them by Time magazine, and perhaps you saw the cover story, which said no longer soccer moms, they're now security moms. And in the analysis of what that was the swing decisive vote in the 2000 election, what those people are now saying, those women, is we care more about the safety of our kids. They're not so concerned about all those issues that seemed so pressing to them in 2000. What they want to know now is, are my kids going to grow up in a country that is safe? And as to their opinion about abortion, 51% said they favored banning it outright, and another 17% said limiting its application. Went from a pro-choice majority to a pro-life majority. Red Wing, Minnesota, front page article in the New York Times just a few months ago talked about all the kids in school are pro-life while their parents are pro-choice. And the New York Times reporter was trying to figure it out. Well, the kids are getting serious. Colleen Carroll, who now is a speechwriter at the Bush White House and who was a very competent journalist for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, did a book called The New Faithful, which she published last spring, in which she said the kids are asking the right questions. The kids want more orthodoxy. The kids want something they can believe in, and they're beginning to affect their boomer parents who have been carried away in this decade of me, radical individualism, do your own thing. The kids are coming home asking the right questions. What a time to be running a Christian school, 900-some students, where you're informing their minds and making them think Christianly. What a wonderful moment. What a wonderful moment for all of us to come out, because we're the one people in this world who have the answer to those who are looking for hope and meaning and purpose and are struggling to make sense out of life in the age of terrorism. What a wonderful time to present the gospel. What a wonderful time to do the gospel in our midst, to let people see what happens when Christians live out their faith. You have a wonderful challenge and a wonderful opportunity as you're working with these kids. I have been so thrilled tonight listening. Kevin was the first one to do it, and then it was repeated by several people afterwards when they talked about how important it is to get a world and life view into the heads of these kids. One of the great reasons that you would send a young person today to a Christian school is because they would not only would they not be subjected to the preposterous sex education that goes on in the public school system, not only would they not be subjected to the value-free teaching, which is preposterous as well, in which kids are told, do whatever you want. Whatever you think is true for you. Whatever you think is true for you is true for you. But they're understanding that all of life is at root in God's hands. That every single discipline they study, biblical truth is at the root of it. I mean, science makes no sense if there's not an orderly universe, and an orderly universe is what postulated all the great scientific discoveries. Where does an orderly universe come from? It doesn't come from chance collision plus time plus random process. It comes from a creator, intelligent design. Music makes no sense unless you understand that there's an order and a pattern to the universe and a designer. Beauty is an absolute, and it reflects the beauty of the creator. And young people today have to be grounded in a biblical understanding of life. They have to understand that Christianity is not just salvation, as wonderful as that is. And I spoke this morning at St. Petersburg and gave some of my testimony, and every time I think about that moment in the driveway 30 years ago when I gave my life to Christ, I realize how grateful I am to God for what he has done. I'd otherwise, at this point, be suffocating in the stench of my own sins. But I can be free in Christ. But salvation is only the middle of the book. It starts with creation. It starts with an understanding of human nature, our fall, our disobedience to God, then the redemption of the good news of the gospel, and then the purposeful living. And the purposeful living is to restore the creation to the majesty and beauty with which God has invested it. To serve the kingdom. I live in Naples, Florida, which is a wonderful retirement community. You see all these people come down and they just wither on the vine because they don't have any purpose in living. You know, the CEO, he finally figured, I'm going to get my paradise. And I come down to Naples and I build my home and I've got this wonderful place and I go out and play golf every day. And quickly, 6 months, you see him begin to wither, lose his interest, drink too much, grumble about the gardeners. Nothing to do. We're made to work. We're made to be creative. And the wonderful thing about the Christian life is that we continue to be creative because we are continuing to attempt to restore this dominion God has, and to exercise this dominion God has given us over his creation. Abraham Kuyper, who was a great scholar in the latter part of he would really approve of what you're doing in this school here tonight. Abraham Kuyper was a great theologian, great teacher. He was the founder of Free University in Holland in the latter part of the 19th century, the turn of the 20th century. He was a marvelous Reformed Christian scholar, and he then formed the Christian Party, Christian Democratic Party, and was elected prime minister of his country. Abraham Kuyper, when he was dedicating Free University in Amsterdam, said these words: "There is not 1 square inch in the whole domain of human existence as to which Christ, who is sovereign over all, does not cry out, 'Mine.'" And brothers and sisters, ladies and gentlemen, if Jesus calls out mine, we call out as his church, we call out his. And it means we have to look at all life through the prism of the Bible. We have to look at all of life through God's eyes and then live our lives accordingly. That's why I believe so strongly in Christian education. If you go into the schools today, you will see that kids are taught value-free, non-directive education. I clipped an article of the New York Times recently, which a number of years now, actually, an older article. Teaneck, New Jersey, 15 students. New York Times reporter went down to Teaneck, New Jersey to watch the students, and they were taking a class, and the instructor said to them, "What would you do if you walked out of the door and you found $1,000 lying on the street?" And then she went around the classroom. All 15 kids said, "I would keep it." The New York Times reporter went up to her afterwards and said, "You didn't correct those kids. Obviously, they should have turned that money in." "Oh," she said, "it's not my place to correct them. I have to just assist them to find their own values." Nonsense. I'm dealing with thousands of kids out in the prisons today who determine their own values too, and their own values would have knocked somebody off or buy drugs. Kids have to be civilized. All of us know that. Anybody who's ever had a child knows that we bring barbarians into this world, and the job is to civilize them. That's pure nonsense. The second thing is that the secular educational establishment today has been taken over by people who are philosophical naturalists. I was just with my granddaughter this weekend, and she's a sophomore at the University of Georgia, and she's taking a course on biology. And so she started to show me some of her textbooks, and I said, Caroline, don't you realize what they're saying? They're saying in there that if, as we assume, the earth was created through a naturalistic process, then the following occurred. But if, as we assume, isn't science, that's philosophy. And all the other postulations, all the other formulas that they give you, all are based upon one assumption, naturalism. It's a closed box. And even scientific evidence about intelligent design, of which there is so much today, is inadmissible in a classroom in a secular institution today, by and large. There are exceptions, because it violates the philosophical premise. That's not science. That's philosophy. And the academic establishment is absolutely captive to it, both in the secondary schools and in the colleges. The American Association of Biology Teachers says that evolution is unsupervised, impersonal, unpredictable, and natural. And that's what's being taught in the schools. Thank God that 900 kids here in Lakeland are hearing the other side of that, that there is mounting, growing evidence for the anthropic principle, for the fact that this universe, this earth in which we live, is uniquely positioned just exactly the right distance from the sun, so that if it were slightly closer, everything would boil away. If it was slightly further away, everything would freeze over. Life would not be sustainable. That sort of thing can be discussed in your classrooms. That sort of evidence which cannot be discussed in the secular schools. Einstein couldn't get through a class in biology in a secular school in America today. Einstein, who said God does not play dice with the cosmos. Einstein, who said there has to be an intelligent mind behind it, couldn't survive on your typical campus today. And the other thing that bothers me so much about the secular establishment today is that they're not teaching educational knowledge, they are teaching a process. So that you get Columbia University Law School, one of the half-dozen best law schools in America, where 2/3 of the students were asked where the following statement came from. The students were asked where the following statement came from, and 2/3 said it was our founding fathers. And this is the statement: from each according to his ability, and to each according to his need. 2/3. I mean, I think those students should flunk that course. No, better yet, fire the teachers who teach them that. A couple, according to the report, a couple got the right answer: Karl Marx. Astonishing. But the real issue today, and this is where I want to concentrate these few remarks this evening, the real issue today in our society, and that's why my talk is entitled Whatever Became of Truth, is the issue of truth. Francis Schaeffer, 25 years ago, those of you who remember him, funny little guy that looked like he came out of the mountains wearing knickers and his little goatee, he would stand up and he would say, the issue is truth, truth. There is such a thing as truth. And this is where the culture war is being fought today. Schaeffer understood it precisely. Is there anything that is true, and is it knowable? Most important thing you can do is you renew the minds of your kids as they listen to the words of the Apostle Paul, do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. As they listen to the words of Jesus, love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, and soul, as they begin to think Christianly, is to be able to absorb the fact that there is truth and it is knowable. We're the ones that have to do that. It will not get done apart from those of us like those of us assembled here for this wonderful dinner. It won't get done because it's been lost. The concept of truth has been lost in our society. A poll was done by Gallup recently in which he found that 64% of the American people said there's no such thing as moral truth. Everybody makes up their own rules. You want to live in a society like that? You better start putting some bars on your windows and gates in front of your house. And don't feel too smug about that shocking statistic. because when that same question was asked of born-again Christians, according to George Barna's figures, 54% said there's no such thing as moral truth. I don't get it. Some of you teachers here maybe understand this. I don't. That's cognitive dissonance. It just doesn't connect. Here we are, we're saying we're the ones who follow the one who says, I am the truth. Ultimate reality is in Jesus Christ. By him, through him, and for him are all things made and held together. And I don't believe there's any such thing as moral truth. I can't understand it. Most frightening is that same question was asked of teenagers. Teens answered 83% no moral truth. 6% said there is. Among born-again teenage kids, 9% said there's moral truth. Folks, we got a huge job to do. If there's no moral truth, there's anarchy. But the fact of the matter is that there is truth, and it is knowable. 4 ways you can know truth. Number 1, I believe this is the inspired and authoritative Word of God. I believe the canonical councils over a period of 500 years studied every single one of those original manuscripts. I think this book has been subjected to all kinds of challenges over the years. I have no hesitancy in saying this is God's inerrant Word. He has given it to us, and this is the way it was written from the original autographs as best we can possibly now find it through all these years of scholarship and study. This is the truth. But don't walk out of here and argue that with your friends and neighbors who aren't believers. Because the answer is going to be, that's the Bible, and you believe in the Bible, Mr. Colson, but I don't believe in the Bible. I've run into this constantly. If I try to say, it's true because the Bible says it is true, there is truth here, there is moral truth, then people are going to say, you go by your Bible and I'll go by mine. But there's a second way you can know truth. One of the things I love about living in Florida is in the summertime, particularly to walk out on the beach and to look at the gorgeous cloud formations. I see the extraordinary nature around us. I don't believe it's possible to look at that and say, first of all, that beauty isn't an absolute. Why does it exist only on this planet? All of our interplanetary probes find nothing but dust bowls in other planets, and yet there's this beauty here. And you see the majesty of the sea and the mountains and the clouds, and this incredible creation has to be created. Just by looking at it, you know that. The wonderful words of the apostle in Romans. Since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made. Look around at the stars and the planets and the galaxies in perfect harmony. You know there is truth. You know there is a creation. I watched television one night. I don't normally do this, but Phil Donahue made his return to TV, as you may remember, some months ago with much ballyhoo. And the Donahue Show is one of the shows that I have been on over the years that I have refused to go back to. I can show you my scars if you'd like to see them later. It's a terrible show because he puts on such a performance and he berates anybody who's there. And if you try to respond as a Christian, it's almost impossible. He rolls all over you. Well, during his return to TV, he had Jerry Falwell on one night, and so I wanted to see how Jerry was doing it. And Donahue had the audience stacked against Jerry, and it was just brutal watching it. And my heart was aching for my friend Jerry Falwell. But Jerry did a wonderful job. He kept quoting Scripture and throwing Scripture back at Donahue, and Donahue was getting angrier and angrier, and he'd prance around the platform. You've seen him do it, and he'd slap his forehead, and he goes through all those gyrations. 1 hour program. And mercifully, he didn't continue. That program has not continued, which simply proves to me that there is a God in heaven. But that night, he was really after Donahue and really after Falwell. And right near the end of it, he said, well, Reverend, he said, Reverend, you must think I'm an atheist. And Falwell didn't say anything. He just kind of looked at him and he said, I'm not an atheist. He said, walk outside and look at the stars and the planets. He said, I can't believe this perfect order could be here if it weren't for the fact that there was a God. I wanted to jump up. I wish I'd been on the set. That was the only time I ever wished I was on a Donahue program. I would have jumped out of my chair, run over, thrown my arms around him and said, you got it, Phil, you got it. That's it. You can see it. You're without an excuse. And you push people to a corner in that, and they can't come back at you. There's no way they can say that. You cannot look at it like finding a watch on the beach. Somebody made that watch. When you look at the beauty of this creation, people are without an excuse. The third way you can know God is there's a law which is written on the human heart, as the Apostle Paul says in Romans 2. Remember, he refers to the Gentiles who didn't know the law, but their consciences are alternately convicting and defending them. We know the truth because, as my friend Jay Budichevsky, a great scholar at the University of Texas, says, there is a truth which cannot not be known. It's true because we know it's true. Theologically, we know that because the imago Dei is in every single human being, and it's distorted by sin, that is true, but we still can know enough to understand there is truth that can be known. Same granddaughter I just mentioned, who's at the University of Georgia, when she graduated last year from high school, at the end of her senior year, I was invited to speak at her baccalaureate service. And that was a great opportunity because there were 600 kids. It's a big suburban public high school outside of Atlanta, northwest side of Atlanta. And it was a great opportunity, 95% of those kids going on to college. And so I accepted happily to give the baccalaureate address, except for the fact that 3 days before I got there, they told me that there would be Hindus and Buddhists and Muslims and Jews, and therefore I should make my religious message general and applicable to everybody in respect to tolerance. And I said, well, that's fine with me because all I'm going to do is talk about my own experiences, which is exactly what I did, telling how I came to Christ. But when I got the platform, it was marvelous because I knew there was a lot of tension about the fact that I was such a visible, well-known Christian. And so my first little lecture was about tolerance. I said, you know, tolerance doesn't mean that we don't say things that other people might be offended by. It means we sit and listen respectfully to whatever anybody else has to say. And, you know, when I was in the Marines, I was perfectly willing to give my life for those wonderful words in the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal and endowed by the Creator with certain inalienable rights. And my right is to have my right of free speech. And I'll respect yours and you respect mine. And since I got the platform today, you're going to have to listen to mine. And the kids loved it. And in the middle of it, I said, now, you're all going to college. I know 95% of you are going to college. And what's going to happen in college is somebody's going to come along to you and tell you that there is no such thing as truth. And when they tell you that, because that's being taught on all the campuses, when they come and tell you that everything is subjective, you can't know anything to be objectively true, and you can't know anything to be truth, when they come and tell you that, you're going to smell smoke, because that comes straight from the pit of hell. I said, you know better, and used an old example that Francis Schaeffer used years ago. I said, you're walking up to a street corner, there's an old lady standing there, she's got shopping bags, and the traffic is whizzing by her in both directions, and you arrive there, and there she's standing there looking a little bewildered. You have three choices. You can ignore her, you can help her across the street, you can push her into the traffic. Do you know which one is right? Kids did what you did, they chuckled, and then they sat and listened intently to the rest of what I said. And my granddaughter told me for 2 weeks, that's all those kids talked about. Of course you know what's right. Of course people do. The whole process of what you're doing with young people in the family and what you do with young people in schools is to inform and shape that conscience, but they're born with that capacity for understanding right and wrong. Nonsense to say there's no such thing. And fourth, the way we know there's right and wrong is we look at the various propositions and the presuppositions which form people's worldviews. Everybody's got one. I talk about worldviews, and a lot of people, their eyes begin to glass over. They think that's one of those academic, scholarly terms that only professors in tweed jackets smoking pipes talk about on college campuses. No, worldview is simply the basic understanding of how the world works and how you're going to fit into it. Christians have a wonderful worldview because we're told here of the creation and the fall and redemption and restoration. You can see in that pattern exactly how the world works. Every question about the world's formation is answered in Scripture. But everybody's got one. Secular naturalists today say that we arose from a cosmic accident, that light rays refracted at a certain angle, came down, hit the primordial soup, molecules bounced off, they happened to be all left-handed, 100 of them. They lined up. Over a period of time in this primordial soup, they formed one cell, and the cells began to mutate, and then cells joined with cells, and here we are 8 billion years later, grown-up germs. People believe that. They really do. Then life is random. And then what you do is what works best. You don't do what is best for people because you have no standard for what's best for people. There is no truth. Relativism is rampant in our society. Or there's Islam, which looks at a very angry God from whom there is no grace. And since there has been no sin because Adam was forgiven after he came out of the garden, then just give us the power to create a perfect society. What Osama bin Laden is asking for is exactly what Hitler asked for, exactly what Stalin asked for. I can make a perfect society. I can relieve you from your oppression. Listen to what Osama bin Laden is telling the people. You're oppressed, and we can release you from that oppression and set you free. The utopian dream, the utopian vision that left hundreds of millions murdered and massacred in the 20th century. Everybody's got a worldview. The question is finding out which one works. You don't follow it because it works, not pragmatism. You don't do it just because it works, but you do it because it conforms to reality. That's the definition of truth. It conforms to the way things are. So look at worldviews. Do they work? Fundamental question. I was watching a congressional hearing about 8 or 9 months ago. Christopher Reeve was testifying. And Christopher Reeve testifying in favor of embryonic stem cell research, taking human embryos, cloning them, and then all these promised cures for the dreaded diseases will flow from it. And he was making a very appealing case. Christopher Reeve is a very appealing man. Heroic effort that he's made to come back from having a broken neck, falling off the horse riding and going over the jumps, and he is now in a wheelchair and very eloquent, very excellent spokesman for his cause. And here he was saying to this congressional committee, we want embryonic stem cell research because it's going to provide an answer for all of these diseases. And so appealing. Everybody has someone in their family with Alzheimer's or Parkinson's or one of these awful diseases. And maybe this could be the cure. There's no evidence it is, but maybe this could be the cure. And one of the congressmen raised an objection and said, well, Mr. Reeve, we appreciate you. He was standing there with several aides in his wheelchair. We appreciate your testimony, and we understand this is a very noble cause you're engaged in, but there's the morality of whether we should take a human embryo and perform medical experiments upon it. He said, and then Christopher Reeve answered, but he said, Congressman, think of the good we can do. Isn't it the job of government to do the greatest good for the greatest number? All the congressmen's heads nodded, press nodded. I tell this story in many crowds, their heads nod. That's democracy, the greatest good for the greatest number, isn't it? No, that's a deadly, deadly utilitarianism. And no one thought to say to Christopher Reeve, Mr. Reeve, if that were the prevailing philosophy in America, you wouldn't be sitting here to give testimony. Because somebody had to spend millions of dollars to bring him back to life after he had his neck broken, and they spend millions of dollars every year to sustain him. All that money could go for inoculations for poor kids in Africa. You wouldn't be spending it on one person in a wheelchair. Utilitarianism reduces life to the coldest possible calculus. Is it valuable to society or not? And Americans today are practical utilitarians. The biblical worldview says every single life is precious, whether it's a kid dying of AIDS in Africa, whether it's a baby about to be born in the womb, whether it is a person who is on life support equipment in the terminal stages of his life. Every single person is precious in God's sight. Fundamental differences. But does utilitarianism work? If it's true, if it's a true way to live your life, it's going to work out in practice because it's going to conform to the way things are. Well, as a professor at Princeton University, Professor Peter Singer, an Australian bioethicist. He has the chair in ethics at Princeton University, distinguished chair. And what he basically says is that we should do the greatest good for the greatest number, and that is increase the sum total of happiness for all people. So no one should live on more than $30,000 a year, because whatever they have more than $30,000 a year can go to help people who don't have anything. Of course, when he was asked what he does with his $250,000 a year Princeton salary, he doesn't comment. Lives very well in Princeton. He also says that anybody with Alzheimer's should not be sustained. Once you get a diagnosis of Alzheimer's, you should be quietly put to sleep. Only problem is his mother has Alzheimer's and he keeps her alive in a home. He can't live with the logical conclusion of his own belief system. It's impossible. He further says that children should be born. We shouldn't worry about all of the ultrasound and amniocentesis. We should just let them be born, and if they're defective, let's have a 2-month period, or other times he said it could be a 6-month period in which we decide whether we want to keep them or simply put them to sleep. Infanticide. He's also very big on speciesism. He believes that we are actually like racists towards animals. We're speciesists, and that is we discriminate against other species. And so someone carried him to the argument. He said, all species are absolutely alike. And someone asked him in a debate once, well, what about, one of my colleagues, as a matter of fact, what about bestiality? And at least he's consistent, Peter Singer. He said, well, I think there's nothing wrong with that. In a later debate, he was asked, how about consent? And he then later said, well, animals can consent. I mean, this man is a lunatic. If you didn't have a Peter Singer, you'd have to invent a Peter Singer. But what he does every time he talks is to give us a tremendous opportunity to educate people on the fallacy of the secular worldview which dominates us today. A worldview which is naturalistic, which says we came out of the primordial soup, and people can't accept that because we know better in ourselves. We know there's a sense of human dignity. We know we have consciousness. We know we're not simply the product of random chance. Do we know this truth? Of course we know this truth. Common sense tells us some things are right and some things are wrong. And for thousands upon thousands of years, every culture and every society, what C.S. Lewis referred to in Mere Christianity as the Tao, has taught us that some things are good, some things are evil, some things are right, some things are wrong. We know that. We can look around at the creation today and we can see beautiful handiwork of our Creator. And we're not left to wonder, were we spinning as a result of the Big Bang at some point and in orbit, and suddenly through all these evolutionary processes peculiar to this one little tiny planet in all of the galaxies, this beautiful life emerges? No. Pure nonsense. The thing which breaks my heart more than anything else is that I've studied this for years now, and I am so convinced that only the biblical worldview provides answers by which people can live their lives rationally. Only biblical worldview gives you hope for living and a reason for getting up tomorrow morning and doing something useful with your life. Only the biblical worldview protects the dignity of human beings. Only the biblical worldview makes sense, and yet here we sit as the custodians of that worldview, and we're watching our culture drift away from us. That's our challenge. Wherever God has called you to bring this truth to bear in our society, do that. Defend truth in this age of unbelief and skepticism and moral relativism. Do it yourself with your neighbors over the backyard fence. The best apologetics, I'm convinced, are done over the backyard fence or maybe in the barber shop. Everybody gets to see a barber or the beauty shop. And you can make your arguments for what you believe lovingly and reverently. Always be prepared to give a reason for the hope which is within you, but with gentleness and reverence. And train your kids, raise up a generation. What a noble undertaking this is for the Lakeland Christian Schools, to be able to raise up kids who can think Christianly, think critically, bring back logic and use it, apply it in critical thinking to what's happening in the world around us. See how Christianity is at the root of every single discipline they study in school. Be equipped to defend that. When they get to that campus and they run into, as the film showed tonight, an atheist psychologist, wonderful. You should be prepared to give that kid, when he's in college, the marvelous book that Armin Nikolai wrote called The Question of God, in which he took Freud's worldview and compared it to C.S. Lewis's worldview. Hands down, there's only one you can live with. We've got a great case. All we need is the courage and the willingness to study and learn and go out and defend what we believe. God bless you for what you're doing here. I think this is wonderful tonight, and when I was listening to all the people speaking ahead of time, my heart was so warmed hearing them talk about worldview and undergirding the studies of these kids and equipping them to go out into the world. And I know what a challenge that they're going to face, but it's a glorious task that you've undertaken to do this. And I salute you for it and hope that somebody will be here 50 years from now on this platform talking about how the Christians rose up in this era and went out and defended truth in a world of unbelief. God bless you all. Thank you.